All right, go ahead, Lisa.
Great, thanks. I'd like to welcome our speakers today. Louise Seamster is an assistant professor in sociology and criminology and African American studies at the University of Iowa with a courtesy appointment in the College of Law and a non-resident fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Her work focuses on racial politics, development, debt, and infrastructure. Her current book project investigates the financial and political causes of the Flint water crisis. Hannah Zadeh is a graduate student researcher in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Iowa, whose research interests include the politics of data, healthcare, and insurance. And again, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And just trying to get fancy this time. So, okay, here we go. Thanks for having us here. The library through the Digital Scholarship and Publishing Studio has been integral to this project since I arrived here in fall of 2019. So I'm really happy to get to share what the studio has been helping us do with the broader community at the library. So thanks to Leah Moreland for inviting us and to Carlette for helping organize this. And I'm happy that a student, Hannah, who's been involved with this project from very early on since I arrived at Iowa, is here. Then as an undergrad, now as a graduate student, first year PhD in sociology, to help talk about what Hannah's been doing on the project, to kind of illustrate that this project has really been focused on like development of students and students for undergraduate research and graduate research. So this project that I'm talking about today, and so is Hannah, is basically a big data project developed around the Flint water crisis. And today we're going to be talking about what this archive is and why it matters, and some of the challenges inherent to working with it in this way, and some of the priorities of our collaboration, like our collaborative work around the project so far, and looking ahead. And Hannah in particular is going to talk in more detail about the technical challenges of the project, and also contextualize what we've been doing in light of other big data types of text analysis projects. Great. So a very, very brief background on the Flint water crisis itself and the time period we're talking about. So between most of 2014 and 2015, the city of Flint was switched to using an untreated corrosive water source from its previously treated water source that it was purchasing from Detroit. And because that water was not properly treated, the water corroded the water system, including a lot of lead pipes, which among many other causes of harm to the water system that this corrosive water had. And in the end of 2015, after a year and a half of protests and demonstrations and scientific work, residents were finally able to demonstrate definitively that the water was lead contaminated, and convince the state to both switch Flint back off the river and to do some remediative work. But what was became evident pretty soon after that was this was not just a city's problem in bad management, but this was tightly connected to state decisions that had been made, because during the period of the water switch and leading up to it, Flint had been under the control of a state-appointed emergency manager. So state emergency managers in Michigan have almost total power over a city. They're brought in ostensibly to deal with a fiscal crisis, but they get say over everything that happens in the city. They replace all elected official power. And between 2011 and 2015, during the whole period of the lead up to this switch, 4 different officials had been in charge of Flint. And I had come to this project from studying another city in Michigan that had been taken over by the state, Benton Harbor. And as part of my work, I and others had established that this was a very targeted policy in its implementation, directed at majority Black cities in the state, and also cities with a long history of Black elected officials. So on the left, this graph shows that half of Black residents in Michigan in 2014 had no local elected governance, democracy, as compared to about 2 or 3% of white residents. And this map is designed to give you a very general idea of where Benton Harbor is in relation to Flint and Detroit. This is also a map showing the Black population in Michigan, so that all three of these places on this map were under emergency management at the same time. The larger story describes how these things are connected. We will not be talking about that here, but it's part of my book project, currently titled Heads I Win, Tails You Lose, and I'm working on completing the manuscript under contract with Columbia University Press. But I had been studying how emergency management played out in this one city. I've been looking at comparison sites. And at the end of that project, I really wanted to know more about what state officials' perceptions and decision-making, how that played into this local politics, because here we definitely had a story of emergency managers being an arm of the state in these cities, but what was happening in these state bureaucracies, and in this case of the Flint water crisis seemed like a really important case because a state determined decision had led to this local catastrophe. So that became more of a reality when the governor of Michigan in early 2016, Rick Snyder, as part of this bid at demonstrating that he was trying to solve the problem now, just announced that he was releasing a whole bunch of state government emails in this state archive. And he said, quote, "With the release of these emails, anyone will have access to this information," when he released the first big dump. And so, technically they were available to the public in this, sequential release of about 5 different occasions that added up to about 70 large PDF files and about 455,000 pages. But because of the format in which they were released, they've already been moved from one position on the state website to another. So these links are dead already. And the state has expanded its collection when Democrats took over in 2019, but we have not seen any of these supposed 20 million documents that a new investigation was working with. So this is really the main body of public documents that's available to understand the crisis. And it's important to note that this was a voluntary data release. The governor himself is not subject to Freedom of Information Act or FOIA, but a lot of the emails released within this data dump were in some form or another a response to a FOIA request that then kind of got collated together against various agencies and just kind of bundled. But that does not mean that they are organized in any type of way. They're coming from all kinds of people. It's not clear which emails are coming from whom. They're not organized chronologically. And this email I just think is kind of funny because in his bid at transparency in Snyder's very first data dump, they didn't quite maybe think about what was coming out first. So it was just a 200-page release. And this was the first page of emails that in his bid at transparency was entirely redacted. And he got rightly criticized for this. And subsequent emails are actually much less redacted. And most of them are still legible. As for the archive itself, when I started reading these emails back in 2016, I was shocked. A lot of reporters were shocked at what was here. There's no claim to this being a complete representation of what people were talking about during this period. These are emails coming from the governor's office, from Treasury, from the Environmental Agency, Health Department. So a lot of the main state agencies that would have something to do with Flint in different arenas and them interacting with each other. But this is not a complete archive. No archive is going to be complete. It's obvious already that some emails are missing. We're working on sorting out the difference between references to call me, let's not put this on email any longer, versus evidence that emails have been written but might be missing. But even though this is a voluntary data release, there's still a lot in here, and even it's important to see what is there and what's not, which you can do, the deeper you get into it, get a sense of what's actually missing. Very basic stats on our data set. This is the total number of pages, and we, as one indicator of how complex this project is, it's very frustrating because it seems simple. You can see them right there, and yet it's very hard to get a sense of the thing as a whole, for reasons we'll explain. So I used to get asked a lot, well, how many emails are we talking about? And I would say, I have no idea, because since they were released as PDFs, they were not released in the unit of emails. So we will talk about how Hannah's derived proxies for guessing at how many emails, but it seems like it's about 150,000 emails, 150,000 pages of emails, of which there's about 40 to 60,000 unique emails, and 8,600 different senders and receivers, although that's concentrated at, a few main players. And to the degree we know what happened during the Flint water crisis, at this point, a lot of it does come from this archive, even though it's not necessarily a very well-known body of data. But a lot of the key facts that came out after the state was caught trying to obscure the state's role in various aspects, trying to hide what the governor knew when, how financial arrangements were involved, and this is what happened with what's led to my book project. But a lot of these new scandals after the original scandal of Flint being lead poison came from people reading through this archive. And so for several months, when the Snyder data releases were coming out, there were revelations coming out regularly from people using the data, but understandably, it's hard to give people the funding and support to do a multi-year study that this data set deserves. And in this data, there are many, even on a surface level, and this is one reason why it's been a good student project. It's been kind of shocking to see how state employees talk about Flint residents, how seriously they took this situation. There's multiple references to people joking about the situation, complaining about having to do their job, talking about how best to kind of steer Flint residents away from their insistence that something was wrong with the water, and how to gaslight them, and how to kind of avoid enforcing their job of regulation. So this is one example. I don't know that this has been covered in the news, and it's a bit blurry in the copy that we have. But this is right as the news about the lead was finally really hitting national news. And so this is people from the Department of Environmental Quality sending out a news article to one another about some of the news coverage, with this picture where somebody's holding up a water bottle with visible lead particles. And they're saying to each other, in italics, which they had to change the formatting to make that happen, look at all that lead, and then someone responds, it looks like bullet fragments. So even after it had been proven that there really was lead in the water, this is how the actual people in charge of enforcing water quality were responding to that. This was just initially an answer to my question. I'd been coming from Benton Harbor with wondering about state bureaucrats' attitudes towards distressed cities like Flint and like Benton Harbor, because you can see how, if this is how they feel about Flint residents, where it's determined that they actually were poisoned by lead through state action, then how hard did they work to try and prevent this problem from happening in the first place? But I think that there's more still to be learned about from this archive about how this actually happened, which is why I'm working on the book and why we're still working with the archive. And so our goals with making this archive is that while these have been posted publicly on the state website and now archived there, and while you can walk in a superficial level and see some of these usually hidden conversations in this really important way, I think that a lot of what this archive actually has to show people has been hampered by its presentation. So it's not in chronological order. It's in a PDF format. A lot of it was not searchable originally. These are very large files that are hard to even download, and you just swim around in them basically. A lot of duplicates mean that word searches are difficult, and a lot of these, because this was an archive created through FOIA responses, if you look up Flint or water, that's probably how these FOIAs were generated. So most of these emails refer to Flint or water in some capacity. We have wanted to make this data more accessible. So the ultimate goal is to make these emails searchable on a website, but more than making the just the text searchable, to organize them into a database that sorts them by email. So basically recreating the email structure that was lost in the transition to a PDF format. And this is where something that everybody agreed with me sounded very possible, and it is possible. And apparently I just won't give up on things because it's taken a lot longer than it might seem to recreate that metadata. And I really appreciate all the work Hannah has done in particular in making this happen. But just these are 2 pages of emails as an example. To our eyes, we read this as an email thread. It's a bit complicated, and you might take a minute to sort out, okay, which one came first, which one is forwarding what, who is getting sent what, where are the attachments? But we can figure it out because we've been doing this for our job for years and decades. But a computer would not read this same data and be able to sort out where are the forwards, where is the threading, where are the attachments, who is sending what to whom, what's the signature section of these emails. Hannah's going to explain more about some examples of what it's been like to take the text as it's presented here and translate that back into email metadata structure. And so these difficulties in using the archive really underscore how, when we're talking about making data, especially digital data, accessible, it's much more than just like putting the data online or making it public. It would take a ton of time and resources to be able to read through it all, much less to be able to get a grasp of what is there and what is not. Like the need to be able to know how many emails are there and who was sending what to when is a really different question than how did people even talk about a specific issue. And also, given that the state did play a role in generating the crisis, we need an independent platform aside from the state to work with and archive these materials. And so it was kind of designed as a model project for me to figure out how these processes work and to think about big data. And it's been great to think about that alongside my students, most of whom come from the social sciences, but it's a really interdisciplinary group, and most of whom do not have technical experience to begin with, to kind of come to this with a more almost qualitative ethnographic approach, not having been trained in computer science, although I've talked with a bunch of computer scientists about this, realizing that our approach is different and kind of celebrating that, I guess. So we've been thinking, when we met the studio, it really clicked as a great place for us to be in my learning about the digital humanities. And finally, I felt like all of my mismatch with computer scientists went away, and I could understand and explain what what I'd been trying to do this whole time. So for instance, the methodology of digital humanities emphasizes collaboration. It emphasizes that your data analysis begins at the point of looking at and organizing and cleaning your data rather than some separate stage. And that had always been really salient to us, that I didn't ever want it to be one team just doing this grunt work of data cleaning that was prior, and then this other group of people who actually cared about what's in it. We spent a lot of time looking at the data in different ways, and that actually led to students finding important aspects of the data set. Like it was an undergraduate who found out that there were breaks within these giant PDFs that allowed us to kind of break them apart into separate email chunks, and that has been crucial to the rest of this work. It also lets students be involved with different modalities. Some of them have been happy to just stay on the qualitative side, and they do one end of this process, and then other students have gotten more interested in working with Python. And we've also developed tools that work for both data cleaning and then for data analysis. So for instance, this graph Hannah made pretty early into finding the emails. And it shows over time how many emails, it's a histogram, how many emails were sent on a given day. And the orange line shows before the duplicate emails have been removed, and the blue line shows afterwards. And this is useful both for us to know what is in here, where are the spikes, the crisis points in the emails. These definitely do track to important moments in the larger timeline. But we've also thought about, well, how can we use this for visualizing the data, for making, showing people what's here. And even just recently, I looked back at this and realized I'm so glad we didn't remove that blue line, the orange line showing the duplicates, because I realized it could be separately important to understand why a whole bunch of people were suddenly getting the same email at a certain moment, or finding a spike that you wouldn't have seen if you were just looking at the unique count of emails. So we're taking qualitative style approaches, like working iteratively over issues again and again, building stuff up slowly to make sure that we are doing things accurately, and it helps us build up a collective understanding in a way that I think is, in the end, much more valuable than if we had magically been able to enter this into a package and had it sorted for us in 2 weeks. I think we wouldn't have understood it in the way we do. So we are also thinking about, at the point that we do have a website and you can experiment with it, this is definitely the primary audience in mind is Flint residents who do still want to understand and publicize what happened. And there's still ongoing investigations and lawsuits. So there's ways this can be at least useful for people to understand what's still not a closed issue. Also to give people a space to respond to and comment on and contribute to what they're seeing, so that they would not just be data consumers. So we're still thinking about ways that people can be involved, whether that's through workshops or exhibits, or creating tools so that they could make their own collection of documents and publish it in some way. Because really, we are seeing the limits of doing maybe more standard traditional quantitative social science analysis, and also that may not be the appropriate response to this data. So we're thinking a lot about ethics and working on getting in touch with people who can help advise us locally, including the archivist at University of Michigan Flint has started working with us as of last year, and I'm really happy to talk about that. But one thing we learned is that they do not have a lot of information themselves as a body of data to show people who come in all the time looking for information on the water crisis. And so the archivist was really excited that we would have something that they could then link to for residents. I've about hit my time to hand things over to Hannah. I was just showing, this is an example of the need to do that close reading that you would miss when you do quantitative work, which we can talk about later. And I want to just conclude my section by talking about the benefits of working with the studio. They, especially with Matthew Butler, has helped train students with Python and help support some of our students directly through their work. They have built data analysis tool for us, and really helped us think through the material, like the details of designing this project. And then they're also now hosting our data on the server. And we could talk about our decisions around that. About why we migrated the data to AWS and then migrated the data back to the library recently. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Hannah now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today and sort of pick up by talking about some of the like nitty gritty of how we've been actually trying to like make this website and this database happen. And I guess sort of picking up on like what Dr. Seamster was just saying about the studio, just want to echo like how important the studio has been to like my time on the project, and especially like Matthew Butler and Liam Moreland really like facilitating my experience as a research assistant on the project. And so I wanted to sort of talk about like our process for I started on this project I think like 2.5 years ago, and so sort of our progression with understanding the data set and understanding what it's going to take to make it into a database that is more publicly accessible. So a lot of this, like Dr. Seamster was saying, has been really about collaboration and like team-based undergraduate research, like it says on the slide. So when we started, it was me and another research assistant who is now at the University of Michigan, Levity. And so we started by just sort of looking at the data and just sort of mapping it out and trying to understand and trying to pick out like what the problems were. So a lot of the early work we did was collaboration in that way and sort of workshopping. And that sort of general structure has continued of collaboration and different people doing different things based on what sort of speaks to them about the project. So as I'll talk about a little bit later, that's involved like sort of handing things back and forth. Like maybe I run something in Python and then have someone else check it. And also workshops in learning how to use Python for this project. And so the pictures on the screen are just screenshots of like really early stuff we did, trying to map out like the structure of some of these emails. And then on the next slide, last spring, Dr. Seamster taught a research class, and at the end of which was centered on this data set and like learning about sort of iteratively working with data and sociology. And it kind of ended up as we split into two teams, and one team ended up trying to experiment with different ways to code the data qualitatively. And then the other team was working on improving the email annotation tool, which is the left image is a screenshot of that tool that Matthew Butler developed for us. And then the right picture is the research presentation poster. So we gave a presentation at the end of the class. And yeah, so those are just sort of some examples of what like team-based undergraduate research has looked like on this project. And I'll give some more examples of that along the way too. So as Dr. Seamster sort of talked about, this idea of like turning this body of emails into a data set. I mean, maybe different people have different reactions to it, but I definitely, when I started the project, I was like, that sounds not like, I'm sure that there's like a computer scientist somewhere who can like push the buttons, like, and I didn't have any like computer science background or anything like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what does exist for processes for data cleaning and doing research on email data sets. So the next slide shows, one of the most notable and really at this point still sort of the only large public email data set is from the Enron scandal. The FERC, Federal Energy Regulation Committee or something like that, sees their emails during the investigation of Enron. And so it's basically this huge corpus. And so Maddie in the comment had mentioned data politic or the politics of data. And I think that's a really important part of this project. Dr. Seamster was talking about the context of how we obtained, or of how these emails were released. And the context of obtaining that data is very different from the context that they obtained the Enron email data, because for the Enron emails, they had sort of the strong arm of the law or on their side to seize these emails. And so you can see in the screenshot of the Enron email data set, when they obtained the Enron emails, they were outputs that were directly from their email clients. So they were already pre-organized into email folders, and the metadata was already extracted from the emails. And so that is not the case for our project. And so a lot of the work that has been done on the Enron email data set has been on data cleaning the Enron email data set has been of limited use to our project because they're starting at a different point. So we're actually trying to get to this point of having the metadata extracted. And so a lot of the other work that has been done with respect to building email databases and getting information from large bodies of emails has been in the context of something called e-discovery. And if people aren't familiar with e-discovery, it's basically, so when lawyers are in the period of discovery in a court case, nowadays it's a lot more likely that the evidence that they might want to pull might come from emails. So they might be looking through, like, say, like a corporation's emails, and they might have a huge body of emails to look through, and they just want to extract the relevant information from that large body of emails. And so there has this kind of problem has created like a whole a market for these tools for doing this kind of thing. So there are a lot of companies who offer e-discovery services and offer these kinds of things. But as a result, these algorithms that are used to extract information from email corpuses and to even like manage emails, like the sort of software to do that is proprietary. So we, one of the important parts of this project is the public access part and documenting our process so that potentially if there are, and we know there are other examples of PDF email, large amounts of PDF emails that might benefit from these processes and scripts. And then another thing, so the screenshots on this slide are from the website of one product called Logical. And I was just sort of pointing out here that even in this website, of course, we don't know for sure, but I would assume that, again, they're getting emails in the format of direct outputs from these email clients. So like PSTs is, I believe, the output that you get when you export out of Outlook. So again, the metadata is already extracted. It's unlikely to me that they are that they are ever getting really like PDF emails. And that, so long story short, it's unlikely that this process has been done before and it's just sort of behind a paywall. Yeah, so that gets us to our data cleaning process. So on the next slide, I just wanted to point out some of the problems that we run into, and that is sort of what on a day-to-day basis we're sort of trying to overcome. So OCR errors. So the PDFs were originally just flat images and they underwent optical character recognition to turn them into text. And you can see from the top picture that this often does not go ideally. OCR works pretty well generally, but a lot of these PDFs are sort of rough. There are some PDFs where it looks like they printed them out and then rescanned them, which really sucks. And then so Dr. Seamster talked about email duplicates. So deduplicating emails is something that's important. And the OCR errors makes that more difficult because you might have two emails that are actually the same email, but they get OCR differently. And then detecting metadata and detecting email boundaries is really sort of the core of this process. We really want to turn this PDF database, turn this body of PDFs into a database where the unit of analysis is not the page, but the email. And then lastly, grouping emails into threads is a more recent thing that I've been working on to try and really be able to sort of be able to reconstruct these conversations and make it so you can actually read these emails like a story. And I think is another sort of difference from the purpose of our project, or the goals of our project versus the goals of some of the e-discovery services. We're not just looking necessarily for extracting by keyword or extracting like one bit of information. Like Dr. Seamster talked about how she's like really been using this email data set as part of like understanding the story of what happened. So I wanted to just sort of give us an example, sort of our process of one of these problems, so detecting metadata. So I talked about at the beginning how in a lot of this, our sort of like sociology qualitative approach has really just been like starting by reading the data and understanding it, understanding what it looks like. So by reading it, we can obviously see that there is a diversity of presentation for how the email metadata looks. And that presents a problem because you have to write scripts to make it so that it can recognize all the data. So that was always our like step one. And then step two, I would go in with knowing some of those patterns and write a script to recognize email metadata. So on this slide, you can see on the left is just like body of text. And then I put in color-coded squares, just as an example, 3 of the metadata. And so on the right, you can see it's in JSON format, which is just a database format. And so you can see it recognized that Richard Benzie was the sender, that Stephen Bush was the recipient in under 2, and Veronica Willard was CC'd. And then same with the other metadata. I just chose those 3 boxes as an example. So I built that script. And then as always, you run into a million mistakes, which is really where this sort of collaboration works really well. I was able to hand it off to another team member and they could go through and audit it and point out what kinds of things, what kinds of errors come up and what needs to be accounted for in the next iteration, version 300 of the script. So as an example here, some of the things that tripped us up in the beginning was page breaks. So when there was a page break between that split metadata in half, and then OCR errors again. So you can see on the right that in this particular page CC got OCR'd as CEC. So really keeping like a catalog of those common OCR errors is something that has been important. And I think that's my last slide. So I will hand it back over to you, Dr. Seamster.
Thank you. I have so many things. I lost my unmute, but yeah, I'm really interested to hear what you all think in your questions and comments. And I've laid out a few of our planned next steps already, but I mean, we're excited looking ahead to this next stage. I mean, we've really been in a preliminary stage for a long time, but it's been a very interesting one. It's a balance between wanting to get people involved as soon as possible so that people can have input in even these stages. So we've been thinking about like even the politics of what this data is and how the design supports that, how its use can be designed in different ways depending on who that main audience is. We've thought a lot about and even evolved somewhat on what the kind of package of products that we want to make available is. So we know the website is really important in making as little friction as possible between people and actually seeing the data in a lot of different ways, whether that's spread out over time, whether that's seeing network analyses, whether that's stories like about smaller vignettes about it so that people can find ways in, and having like a really strong, simple search capacity for people to use. We know that we're going to be all the code that Hannah and others have developed is up on GitHub, and that we're going to make sure it's all organized so that other people could adapt it. And Hannah has even evolved to building from no Python at all to building like library packages that Hannah's thinking about how to make more standardizable so that people could kind of more drop that code into their PDF projects. But we've been thinking about those projects as compared to something I initially kind of just expected to do by default, which was making this data, the underlying database, available to all researchers. And we can talk later about how putting thinking about audience and priorities in goals has maybe made us rethink some of that, especially in light of how the Enron data has been used. And so to the end of making resident users and other affected communities use primary, we are planning on developing user experience studies, building up an advisory committee that's in Flint, representing different groups, and planning to start collaborating with people this summer and fall in a series of conversations about what types of engagement would be the best for folks using this data, especially the people who care the most about it, in terms of, how much farther beyond a one-day workshop do we need to do? It's probably not enough to just teach people how to use the data, but how do we make this more a longer term engagement? What happens when we hear back, this is digital data, but people don't want to work with it digitally? So what's great about it is a lot of the things that are challenges become really interesting to ways to rethink or be creative about the problem. Because, my mind starts going, well, what if you make an exhibit where it's really easy to print out a page and you start making a timeline on a wall, that we don't have to be limited to think about what how you can kind of transcend a digital archive and make it analog again, and not just expect that the only way it's worked with is on a website. So that has been very interesting for us to think about, and I'm glad that students can continue to be involved at this stage, because I think it's really important for students to be involved in this as well, and to think about research as not just what we can do and what we can publish out of it, but where it's going and why we're asking the questions we're asking with it, and which questions are of most use to people. and just to reiterate, like the people who've been pushing for citizen science and for advocacy and for more information and more storytelling to come to light is the Flint residents, and has been this entire time since their water was first switched in April 2014. Like they've been the ones who've been insisting that there was more happening. They are the reasons why the nation's attention and the world's attention turned to Flint at all by the fall of 2015. And they've ever since been insisting on getting justice. And this is, one small thing that I can do remotely, and that I can bring students in to help do remotely to offer as a contribution, without us having to, we can bring this without having to ask things from people there. But I look forward to figuring out how we can continue to be of use to people there. And I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording really quick.